Hi, welcome to the Mohua Show. My name is Mohua Chinappa and I am an author, entrepreneur, and ex-housewife. This podcast is about everything from business to technology to arts to lifestyle, but done and spoken ईमानदारी से. Hi, in today's episode, we have with us Revati Lal, an independent journalist and activist whose work is focused on violence and conflict. She started out as a television journalist with NDTV and then moved to print, working with Tehelka magazine and then writing independently for various publications from The Wire to the Hindustan Times and The Quint. Her book, The Anatomy of Hate, was published in December 2018. She currently lives and works in the district Shamli in Uttar Pradesh, where she set up an NGO to work against discrimination called the Sarfaroshi Foundation. What an amazing name, Revati. How did you come up with the name Sarfaroshi Foundation?
Thank you very much, Moa, for having me. Well, Sarfaroshi actually is a song that the revolutionaries of India used in the 1920s poem that basically described the idea of sacrificing yourself for a greater cause. And the word is Persian, and it basically means, literally means the seller of one's head. But actually, it really was the war cry that Bhagat Singh, Ashfaqullah, Sukhdev, and Rajguru used to say that we as a nation will not be free just by throwing the British out. We actually need to throw out caste, gender, and most importantly, religious discrimination if we really want to be free. That, of course, we have not done. So it's an unfinished project that we felt was imperative for us to look at if we want to kind of repair the fault lines of this nation that have only grown deeper with time and with basically a blindsidedness that we all seem to have fallen into in creating and engulfing ourselves in the politics of hate and discrimination. And so that's why when we set out to do this work against discrimination, we could find no better inspiration than Sarfaroshi.
Sarfaroshi ki tamanna.
Sarfaroshi ki tamanna ab hamare dil mein hai. Now the fire of revolutionaries is in our heart.
Absolutely. I completely echo that with you. Let's just come to your book, The Anatomy of Hate. You took 14 years to complete this book, and I'm sure you've had an experience that is beyond just writing the book. Would you like to share that with our listeners?
Sure. Actually, the book came from work I was doing as a reporter, as a journalist. I was posted to Gujarat the year after anti-Muslim pogroms broke out in at least 15 districts of Gujarat, more than half of the state, in the year 2002. And the year after that, I was posted there as NDTV's Gujarat correspondent. And everywhere that I went, people would say, "Aapko samajh mein nahi aayega, humne bawal ka support kyun kiya?" And bawal is the word loosely used in Gujarati for riot. But this wasn't a riot, it was a pogrom. It was a witch hunt against Muslims for what Hindus believed was a bloodletting that the Muslims deserved because a day before the violence broke out, Hindus from the Vishwa Hindu Parishad that were actually part of a Karseva to build the Ayodhya temple where the mosque had been brought down a decade before. There was a riot that broke out between them, and allegedly between them and Muslims at a train station in Gujarat, after which 59 of those Karsevaks were burnt. And after that, there was this bloodbath that was unleashed by mobs all across the state of Gujarat, where people said, "We are going to avenge the killings of those Hindus." Now, how did they come to the conclusion that it was Muslims who killed them? Nobody knows. But this rumor spread like wildfire. At the end of these anti-Muslim pogroms, many women, children were dead, raped, killed, men murdered, houses looted, thousands more. Well, according to the state records, about 1,000 were killed. The unofficial records put the numbers at about thrice that. So when I moved to Gujarat, what I didn't understand is how most of middle-class Gujarat said that they supported this violence. And I didn't understand that. So I said, how has the whole state got radicalized one way? Why do they believe in this politics of hate of the other? What is happening here? How come the wounds of the partition are showing up in a place that was so far away from the epicenter of the partition and a century later? And so that took me down this sort of route where I asked myself, if people have across the state of Gujarat supported this kind of violence, then there is something that we need to ask ourselves about what is making this hate attractive. Rather than looking at the victims, I was more interested in perpetrators. I was interested in why they have this mass support base. And I asked civil society actors, journalists, people I knew and respected at the time and still do, I said, why are we not, as civil society and the media, not working with the perpetrators, isn't their politics and mind space in dire need of some work? Don't we need to understand where they come from and then try and see what we can do to change that politics of hate? Why are they hitting out like this? What is happening here? If we don't look at them and we only focus on the wounds of that, on the victims, we need to focus on the victims, but we even more than that, we need to focus on the perpetrators, or we will fear repeating this politics. And then I saw this, sort of deepen and harden until it engulfed the entire nation. I felt that it was important to address this question. How do you work with the other side? How do you understand hate? But I asked myself this question and I didn't have answers. And then one day the answer walked up to me by accident. Sometimes stories happen to you when you least expect them to. You leave a question out there and it just falls into your plate without you're expecting it to. And so what happened was that the following year, I'd moved back to Delhi, where I'm from, and I was then in Gujarat briefly to track some stories of the riot relief work getting stuck. And I chanced upon a man who was at the edge of the mobs of Gujarat. He took part in the violence in a voyeuristic way. He was a student. He was from a dominant caste. He spoke English. He was doing a master's. So he was not the profile of the mobster that we normally see is somebody who's either from an aspirational caste or from a tribe or from an impoverished background. He came not from an impoverished background. He was middle class. He was Hindu. He was dominant caste, and he spoke English, and he was doing a master's. And when the violence erupted all around him, people from these Hindu mobsters, they came to his hostel and they said, well, now you have this window of opportunity. You guys can go and loot these shops between this time and this time. They've been abandoned by Muslim owners. And after this window of opportunity closes, then the police will come. So you better get out of there before that. So his friends and he went out there as warriors. And to quote him, he said, at that point of time, Gujarat was cut into two halves. The half that was being cut and killed and the half that was out celebrating. And I was with the half that was celebrating. Now, after the violence was done and he was at the edge of the mob, basically looking on while his friends were stealing shoes from abandoned shops by Muslim owners, they came back and the violence finished, the riots were over, and his degree was over, and it was time for him to look for a job. And where does someone who has done a liberal arts degree, now studied medicine, engineering, MBA, law, get a good job with a good salary? And that was the NGO sector. Now, because of the violence and against Muslims, all NGOs and a lot of international NGOs that had swooped into Gujarat were now working exclusively to rehabilitate victims. So, after cheering on for the death and destruction of the Muslims, this man gets a job in an NGO that is rehabilitating them. And that's when my answer to my question, how do you reach out to the other side? This is somebody who, because he suddenly started to work with Muslims, he saw how they were destroyed by Hindu mobs. His idea of the other, which until that point of time was based on fiction, on the myth making that he'd been brought up with, a diet of hate, that these are the others, these are the jihadis, these are the people who cheer on for a Pakistani team during a cricket match, these are the people who have many wives, these are the immoral people, these are the beef-eating people. This is what he had been brought up on. Suddenly, he was confronted with their humanity and their complete and utter breakdown. And he asked himself, if these are not the satanic people that I thought they were, and they're a lot like me, then what does that make me? Am I the son of the devil for having thought that they should be cut and killed and that they had this coming? And he underwent the most traumatizing transformation over the next decade or so. And when I met him, he was undergoing this transformation. And I was gobsmacked. I said, I didn't think that hate could transform, that it could change. And if I didn't think it could change, then I didn't understand the first thing about hate. I also realized that as journalists, what happens is we often fix things. And when we fix them, we describe them, we harden that hate, and we force it into that space. And I felt that is the reason why so many people from these mobs, so much of the Hindu middle class said, you won't understand why we're supporting this. Because they felt that until that point of time, their anger at the elite and what they called the political elite in the country that was socialist and secular, they felt that they needed to upturn that and invert it on its head in order to be seen and heard. And so some of the hate was coming from that space. So if we don't allow that space, I felt, to come out, for there to be a catharsis, for people to be unsure of themselves and uncertain of themselves, we're actually causing this hate to, in some ways, harden and magnify. And so I felt it was imperative to tell this man's story. However, he was undergoing this transformation and he was very shaky about wanting it to be told. He felt that each time he talked about it, was like poking that wound. So I had to pursue him for 13 years for him to let me tell his story. Eventually, when he let me tell his story, I said, this is what I have to do with my life. I had just quit my job. By now, not in television. I had switched to print and I was working at Tehelka. I quit my job. And then after that, I said, now I'm not going to do anything else with my life. I'm just going to work on this, on the politics of hate. And I said, this man is the outer edge of the mob. But who is sitting inside the mob? The people who are the kind of person who's raped and cut and killed Muslim women and children. I needed to understand that kind of hate as well. And so that took me to looking for a protagonist who represented that. And I looked up all the cases, and I zeroed in on a man called Suresh Jadeja. He's someone who is now was serving a 31-year jail sentence until recently, just like Bilkis Bano's rapists and the murderers of her family, also from Gujarat, from the same riots, who have now been let off on Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. This man has also now been let off. But he, Suresh Jadeja, the protagonist in my book, had also, like Bilkis's rapists and murderers, cut and killed and raped Muslim women and children, pulled out the fetus of a pregnant woman, and then bragged about it to the media, who was a colleague of mine who was doing this operation. And he said to him, I pulverized Muslim women till they were pickled. And he did all of this while being married to a Muslim woman. And that is what I found. There are two aspects of Suresh's story that made me want to tell it. One is that he's bragging about his crimes, which means that there is an audience for this. Who is the audience? There is a large mass of people who actually want Muslims to be cut and killed. They feel this is just desserts. And they are outsourcing their hate to someone like Suresh because they don't have the balls to do what he's doing. So he's doing it on their behalf. Therefore, he's bragging to them. The bragging was the most important part of his story, because it told me that Suresh is not one person. He embodies a mass of hate. And when I was reading, about mass violence and genocidal impulses of this kind that have been written about around the world, the most important work on this that I found was Mahmoud Mamdani, the political scientist, his book on the Rwandan genocide in the country called Rwanda in Central Africa, where there was a genocide in 1995 in which almost 100,000 Tutsis were killed by the Hutus. The similar kind of post-colonial conflict of Hindus and Muslims over there, it's the Hutus and the Tutsis. That was a state-sponsored genocide. And what Mahmoud Mamdani said is that we often get stuck in the voyeurism of the crime. Who has been cut and killed into how many pieces, how was a fetus pulled out of this pregnant woman and dashed. We get caught up in the voyeurism and the shock of it, and we actually stop thinking about what lies underneath that. And so what Mahmoud Mamdani said, and that I use to understand Suresh's story as well, is that what is the most troubling aspect of these mass crimes and lynchings is not the actual nature of the murder or the killing. It is the fact that it is popular. The popularity or the mass aspect of it is the bit that needs understanding. So Suresh is speaking to an audience here. That is the bit that distinguishes him from a psychopath who's going out there and killing one person. There is a difference. There is mass approval for this. That is what needed to be understood in Suresh's case. So who was holding up Suresh while he was cutting and killing and pulverizing and pickling women, as he put it? So Suresh comes from a society that has been shunned by India for more than a century. There are nomadic tribes in India, more than 180 of them, that were criminalized 200 years ago by the British. When the 1857 revolt happened, then the British were basically scared that the power will be snatched from them. So they wanted to account for people who are nomadic and who move from one place to the other, because they felt they could be couriers of information to the revolutionaries. And so they incarcerated them. They threw them into internment camps and imprisoned them, and then herded them from one place to the other. So they broke their backs professionally. So they couldn't be traders and nomadic tribespeople anymore. They were forced into these jail cells. After independence, India forgot about them for 6 whole years. So they are free not in 1947, they were freed 6 years later. And then India struck down the Criminal Tribes Act, but the police always picks up people. They say, I'm sure people have heard of people, they say, oh, criminal gangs like the Tyagis. They're actually a denotified criminal tribe who have been vilified like the Charas, the community that Suresh comes from, until they became criminals because they had no other recourse. The social stigma, the fact that the police picks them up and throws them into jail when they want scapegoats for anything that happens in a city, made many of them turn to crime. However, there is another layer to this. It was not as if there was mass acceptance for the kind of crime that Suresh did just because he comes from a denotified criminal tribe. It is many of those people actually went on to change that stigma, become lawyers, filmmakers, teachers, doctors. But Suresh then, so there were two choices before Charas. Either you color yourself darkly and become more hideous than you've been described as, or you get out of it. And Suresh chose the latter, but there's another reason why he did that. And that is the personal fusing with the political here, where he was a child with a bad leg. He had polio, and his father was ashamed of him. So he would be drunk and, talk to everyone in the neighborhood and say, oh, I don't know who my slut of a wife, the whore of a wife has slept with. This is not my son. This motherfucker, sister fucker is not my child. And so when he did that, this 4 or 5-year-old boy's idea of himself, his sense of self was self-loathing, was hatred. And so he starts to go to school and throw stones at the teacher. He processes all his emotions through hate. And then this acquires a larger purpose because he becomes the local gunda. So if you are a chara and you're a landlord and the tenant is not vacating your premises, you can't go to the police because the police anyway sees you as a criminal. So then you will go to Suresh, and Suresh will say, if you don't vacate this property, I'll break your legs. So there were people under his protectorate who he was ensuring this would be safe and protected under him. So that he was the local dada of the slum that he lived in. At this precise time, when he was growing up and became the local dada and his violence and hate found some sort of evangelical purpose, Hindutva groups were looking for local leaders to indoctrinate into the Sangh and to say, okay, you need to go and destroy the Babri Mosque, you need to become cow vigilante forces, Muslims are a threat to Hindus, their population will outstrip you one day. Suresh was consuming all of this, and suddenly his hate found a larger political purpose. And at that precise time, his sister ran away with a Muslim. And so he said, oh my God, he viewed women, as many men do, as property. So he said, they have taken one from my community, I'm going to take one from theirs. And he swore to himself and to the community at large that he was going to take a Muslim woman. So he went about seducing a Muslim woman, and then reality, as you know, is always stranger than fiction. So he basically fell in love with this woman, and he couldn't get over the fact that she fell in love with him because he was so full of self-loathing. So he would regularly beat her, gouge the flesh out of her shoulder, throw her out into the street. So she was his first victim in a sense. Now, when you see all of this, the most bewildering part of the story is that you can understand where Suresh comes from instead of not understanding where he comes from. By understanding, I don't mean empathize with at all. I mean, you can see how this hate reached a point where a man was married to a Muslim and then went about raping and killing Muslims. You can see how a child's self-loathing then blows up into this large-scale thing with an added political heft to it. And you can also see how each of us is complicit in these stories of hate because these are communities that we don't care about. We look at we get stuck in the voyeurism of this hate, and we actually don't look any deeper. And then there's the third story in this. I basically told the stories of 3 random people who allowed themselves to be opened up in this way and for me to be able to access their stories. So it's not by any means representative of all of the mob or any such thing. But these random stories gave me a different way of looking at hate. And that is what I found compelling, because I felt that I didn't understand much of hate at all. And I felt that maybe this will be something that other people might want to read for the same reason. The third protagonist, actually, I'm using to ask the question of all of us. If we don't want the politics of hate to engulf us in the way it has and be normalized this way and become political center stage, then we have to provide an alternative lever of ascendance to people who come from impoverished spaces or spaces where they're looking at joining forces with Hindutva mobs in order to have better political, social acceptance, and money. And that brings me to my third protagonist, who I call Dungar in the book. He is someone who comes from the Bhil tribe in Gujarat, and his village is an extremely economically backward zone. He is someone who, despite coming from a space where most people drop out of class 3 and 4, went to school, went to college, did a BA, pushed against, had to leave his father's home. His father was a drunk alcoholic, so he thought that all Bhils are like his father, and he wasn't therefore proud of being a Bhil. He was snubbed in class for being a tribal with a big nose. So he then emulated his school teacher whose house he lived in, who was Hindu, who was God-fearing, and who upper caste. And he felt he needed to be like him. And suddenly he started to get acceptance. He started to sing in these bhajan mandalis. From there, basically, he got indoctrinated into the Sangh and very quickly became part of the Kar Seva, the Ayodhya campaign, the cow vigilante groups. And his social status it changed, his political status changed, his sense of self changed. But he was someone who burned down houses of Muslims in 2002, but then was full of self-doubt ever since then. So he's someone who swings between these two extremes of Suresh, who is extreme hate, and the young man who I told you about at the beginning, Pranav, who actually comes from a dominant caste and speaks English. Now, all of these three stories are very different from each other, but they told me a few things about hate, that hate is not one thing, it's many things. It's also something that can change. But most importantly, this told me that if we don't want to have this sense of hand-wringing, what can we do? What can we do? How are we going to change? Our country is up shit street. What are we going to do? Is this fait accompli? Can we do nothing? It told me that there's a lot we can do, but we have to look inside this space, not get stuck at the surface level. So that's the journey, really.
You also spoke to an Adivasi, right?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Dungar, this person who I was saying who burnt down the houses, was Adivasi.
You spoke to almost 100 men to write this book.
Men, women, many people. I spoke to more than 100 different. I actually spent a year tracking down many of the people who were accused in these cases, but most of them didn't open themselves up in the way these three characters did. Because most of them were appealing their sentences in court or denying that they actually played the part that they'd been accused of. And so they didn't want their stories told. So I was then left with the idea of either spending many more years trying to explore a pastiche of many people and say devote one chapter to each, or deep dive into these three characters that did open themselves up to being looked at and write it in this way. So I chose the latter.
So tell me something, Revati, how did you put yourself together for this sort of a commitment of so many years, to document this entire anatomy of hate? What was that burning idea or passion inside you?
Well, I just couldn't stand to sit on the sidelines and see the idea of India that I had. And basically, more than that, this idea that narratives and storytelling can change how we think. These two things were in my head since I was quite young, and that's what made me become a storyteller and a journalist in the first place. And that sort of politics that drove me didn't let me sit still. I was a student when the Babri Mosque was brought down. 10 years later, when I was a working journalist, Gujarat happened. 10 years after that, we see the Muzaffarnagar riots of Uttar Pradesh. 10 years after that, we see the Delhi riots. So every decade, there has been communal violence. It is the biggest fault line that we're sitting on. And if we don't understand it, I told myself, am I okay with just saying let life roll along as normal and I'll bake a cake and go to sleep and watch something on an OTT platform? No. I just couldn't live without looking inside this space. I think I'm wired in a way where I couldn't it wasn't possible for me to exist without looking inside this and looking deeply inside this. And the more I looked, the more I felt that there was so much to learn from it. It was so complex. And also there's a space of hope, because I felt that when you look deep inside, the Sangh doesn't have that much power as we give it. It also can change, but we need to work at that change. We can't just be sitting there and saying this is going to fall into our laps and one day the India that we want will manifest itself on its own. We have to make it happen. So I'm one of those people who believes that, okay, if you don't like something, change it.
When did you make the decision of becoming an independent journalist,
It wasn't like a decision, so much as happenstance. I got out of NDTV because I wanted to do longer format storytelling and there wasn't space for that in journalism by the end of the 2000s, by that decade. So I jumped out. I tried various stints at making documentaries on my own. Didn't work. I wasn't being able to make ends meet. And so then I switched to print. I did a stint at Tehelka, and then that fell apart because my editor raped a friend of mine. And then I decided I by then I had the first protagonist that I described in my book had already said that he agreed to let me tell his story. And so then I just decided to do that and write the book. And then from there, I've just sort of fallen into that story ever since. I've decided to work on the solution, because clearly there is another way of looking at hate and working our way out of it. So then that's what I'm doing. So it isn't like I sat one day and decided I'm going to be an independent journalist. This is just how things flowed.
So can you share some inspiring stories, of that you fought against discrimination that, some of our listeners would be interested in knowing?
Well, we're still very nascent. We just started 2 years ago. So I think it's too early to talk about sharing stories of the work I'm doing at present, except to say that it all comes from the space of the book that I've just described, where it's possible to change, and that we are all, as people, constantly in a state of flux. There's nothing fixed about our beliefs. There is nothing fixed about what you may hold true one day and may hold true another day, as long as we are all open. And actually, we are all open to change. It is just that all of us need to have a little bit more self-belief that it's possible. Narratives and storytelling is what makes us who we are. And if you've ever been changed by stories, whether a song or a film or a book or a movie, whatever it is, or a podcast, then you know the power that stories have. They can bend your mind in 1,000 different ways. And that, to me, is the reason to tell stories. That is the reason to do any work that we do. And, the people we work with, some of them have never actually gone into the Muslim quarters of the villages they lived in before, not ever celebrated Eid. But this year, because of the work we've been doing with them, they not only held iftars for Muslims, but places where there had been extreme violence against Muslims. Hindus held an iftars for the remaining Muslims that had not been attacked in their village during the Muzaffarnagar and Shamli riots of 2013. In areas that were the epicenter of that violence, there are people who are now beacons of hope.
So if you were to advise your younger self, Revathi, what would you tell her?
I'd tell her to have a little bit more self-belief and to love herself a little more. It doesn't really matter whether we come from a place of belief or unsure of ourselves. As long as one fine day, or on any particular day, we say, okay, now I'm going to do this. Now I'm not going to kind of say, I was this, I am only capable of this, and today I'm going to shed all that and decided to do this. And that's also okay.
So before I end this episode, I need to say thank you, Revathi. This has been one of the most riveting podcasts that I've done in all the 100 episodes till now. I just need to read out a little bit from your work. The most terrifying truth about a mob is not that we can't understand how they operate, but that we can. What makes a man stand by and watch violence being done to another? What does a woman do after a husband has killed a pregnant stranger? What latent tensions and complexes did the instigators of violence draw upon to unleash the carnage of 28th February 2002? Investigations into mass violence in India and Gujarat 2002 in particular have focused on the consequences, the victims, the political apparatus. The mob has always been a faceless, undimensional machine. But the act of turning around and looking at individuals from that crowd changes everything. If we see the mob as amorphous and their hate as shifting given to complex personal motivation and vulnerabilities, we are much closer to understanding it and to opening up conversations that can lead to change. Revathi Lal's unforgettable narrative, built on a decade's worth of research and interviews, is the very first account of the perpetrators of 2002 and a crucial new addition to the literature on violence. Choice, however, is a vexing word. What part of choice applies when a tidal wave of anger tears through a state? What part of it is the moment, the madness, the collective, and what part individual personal history? Thank you, Revathi Lal. It's an absolute honor for me today to have you on my podcast.
Thanks very much, Mohua, for having me.
To you, our dearest listeners, you can find us on your favorite streaming services, Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, and of course on all other major streaming services. With loads of love, we are The Mohua Show, where we talk ईमानदारी से।